Hi everyone, welcome back. So today we're going to be starting the Chapter 11 lecture note outline. In Chapter 11, we will be learning about intermolecular forces. These are the forces that exist between molecules and ions within matter. To get us started learning about intermolecular forces, let's review what we know about the different properties of the different states of matter. So for example, when we first started this class, we talked about the differences between solids, liquids, and gases in terms of things like their shape and their volume. So for instance, we know that solids have a fixed shape and a fixed volume, whereas liquids have a dynamic shape but a fixed volume. Gases have both dynamic shapes and dynamic volumes. And we related this back to things like the particle arrangements and the movements of the particles in those samples of matter. So, for example, in a solid, we know that the shape and the volume are fixed, and this can be explained by the fact that the particles in solids are packed close together, and they don't have much of a movement. Now, they're not completely frozen in place, but they're not moving around each other like they would be in a liquid. Now, in a gas, on the other hand, we have a completely dynamic shape and a dynamic volume. And we relate this back to the fact that the particles in a gas have a very random arrangement. There's no order to that arrangement. It's completely random. And the movement of those particles is also completely random. Furthermore, there's a lot of space in between all of the particles. And that's a really important point, I think, is that notice that the space between solids is very small. These solid particles making up the solid are packed close together. In a liquid, they're packed close together also, but they're moving around. And in a gas, the particles are spaced very far apart. What does that say about the possible interactions between the actual particles in solids versus liquids versus gases? Well, I think it says that because the particles in a solid are so close together, they have so much opportunity for interaction. Versus in a gas where the particles are very seldom close to each other, there's very little opportunity for interaction between them. So thinking about that opportunity for interaction between the particles, we can try and rank solids, liquids, and gases in terms of which type of matter would have the most interactions. I think solids, because they're packed so closely together, would be first place here. There's the most opportunity for interaction between the particles in a solid because they're packed close together. In a liquids, we would say they're probably in between a solid and a gas because they're still close together, but they're moving past one another. And then finally, a gas. Now, the particles in a gas are very far apart, they're moving very quickly, and there's very little opportunity for interaction between those particles. Now, these interactions that exist between molecules or ions that are in a sample of matter are called intermolecular forces. Intermolecular forces are the forces which cause molecules or ions of a substance to be attracted to one another. And it turns out that when we have molecules or ions that are strongly attracted to one another through these intermolecular forces, we get matter that sort of clumps up together because of all the strong forces between those molecules. This leads to states of matter that are more like solids or clumped up. And when we have very weak intermolecular forces, those forces that exist between molecules or ions aren't really there, the molecules or ions simply fly past one another like they do in a gas. So what exactly are these intermolecular forces and what causes them? Well, that's what we're going to be learning about in this lesson. So it turns out there are 4 types of intermolecular forces. It turns out that not all molecules exhibit all 4 of these forces. Some molecules have a few of them, others only have 1. As such, we will learn to predict which molecules have which forces. We'll also learn about the relative intensity or strength of each particular type of force. And we will also learn the cause down at the atomic level for each of these forces. So here's a list of the 4 types of intermolecular forces. We'll start with London dispersion forces, also known as LDFs. After we understand London dispersion forces, we'll learn about dipole-dipole forces. Then we'll learn about hydrogen bonding and ionic bonding. And I've decided to teach these to you in the order I have shown here from the weakest force to the strongest force. So London dispersion forces are the weakest, and you'll learn why that is, and we will progressively learn about stronger and stronger forces as we move forward. So let's go to the next page where we can start learning about the causes of intermolecular forces. As we learn about each type of force, in general, the things that I want you to be able to understand are the cause and the origin of the force, what's actually happening at the atomic level that makes that force exist. Also, you're going to be learning to take a list of molecules and looking at their structures, predict which forces that molecule could actually have. Finally, if I gave you a list of molecules, I'd want you to rank them in terms of the strength of the forces the particular molecules has, and then maybe also predict some of their chemical and or physical properties that we would expect based on the strength of the forces that are present in those molecules. Now, it turns out that all of the intermolecular forces have one thing in common, and that is that they are caused by something called a dipole moment. Now, let's talk about what a dipole is. We've discussed this before, but let's review the topic. A dipole is something that has two poles. For instance, the Earth is a dipole. It has a north pole and a south pole. A magnet is also a dipole. We can also have molecules that are dipoles, and in molecules, this is caused by the uneven distribution of charge. We use the lowercase Greek symbol delta to represent this distribution difference in charge. We say delta plus is partially positive polarity, and delta minus is partially negative polarity. Now, where does this difference in charge actually come from? Well, to discuss that, let's think about a hypothetical molecule where we have A bonded to B, and B is more electronegative than A. Now, when we learned about the covalent bond, we saw that when we have a more electronegative atom bonded to a less electronegative atom, there ends up being an uneven sharing of the electron pair that comprises the covalent bond between them. So, for instance, in this case, we have B, which is more electronegative than A. B would be expected to have more of the electrons from that double bond around it more of the time. So it would look polarized like this. So while the electron pair is being shared between A and B, more of that electron pair is around B than it is around A. Now, what does that do to the charge distribution in the molecule? Now, A and B are still neutral, but if B has more electron cloud around it, that means B would be slightly more negative than A. So we say that B is electron rich, and that leaves A a little bit electron poor. A simple way of showing this is using our delta symbols to represent electron rich and electron poor, or slightly negative and slightly positive. Now, if we consider the polarity of our example AB here, we see that we have a situation where there are two poles, two electrical poles. We have a positive pole and a negative pole. This is called a dipole. A dipole is simply something that has two poles. Magnets also have two poles. They have a positively charged pole and a negatively charged pole. And we can consider dipoles to act like little magnets. And that's what we're going to be thinking about in terms of our intermolecular forces. So at some level, all of the intermolecular forces that we learn about are caused by the existence of a molecular dipole. Now, the first type of force we're going to learn about is called the London dispersion force, and it too is caused by the existence of a molecular dipole. It turns out, though, that the molecular dipole that causes the London dispersion forces is a temporary dipole. It's one that does not persist for more than just a brief moment in time. Now, to try to explain what I mean, let's think about a molecule such as bromine, which has a bromine atom bonded to another bromine atom, so it's diatomic. Now, on average, the electron cloud around bromine is evenly distributed, and that's because each of the atoms has the same electronegativity. So it's a non-polar covalent bond, and therefore we have an equal sharing of the electrons around each of the atoms. So this is what we see on average. Both atoms have the same cloud of electrons around them, so it's symmetric. So if we're talking about whether or not bromine is a dipole based on what we're looking at here, we would say no, right? A dipole requires there to be more electron density on one side than the other, and this is the exact opposite of that. We have an equal sharing of the electron cloud around the entire atom, so this looks like a non-polar bond, not a dipole. Now, it turns out this doesn't tell the entire story, and that's because electrons are not just sitting in one place. They are moving around. And if the electrons are moving around, that means we will have an uneven distribution of those electrons at different times. Say, for example, we looked at this bromine molecule at time 1 and then again at time 2. Now, at time 1, we might see the electron cloud more around the first bromine than the second one. And at time 2, it would be the exact opposite. Maybe the electron cloud is more around the second one than the first one. In either case, we have the existence of an asymmetric distribution of electrons. The electrons are more on one side than the other. This is a dipole. Now, of course, it's a temporary dipole. We have the delta negative and the delta plus, depending on where the electrons happen to be at that particular moment. For this reason, we call this the existence of a momentary or a temporary dipole moment. And it's actually the existence of this temporary or instantaneous dipole moment that leads to the weakest of the intermolecular forces, known as the London dispersion force. Let's see how that works on the next page. So as we saw on the last page, the existence of a temporary dipole around a molecule can be caused by the uneven distribution of electrons. Now, this dipole moment that exists temporarily will cause the molecules to be attracted to one another. So we see that if there's a negative end of a molecule, the negative pole, it's attracted to the positive pole of another molecule. So it's electron rich to electron poor to electron rich to electron poor. So all of these interactions that are shown here in the arrows represent the intermolecular forces that exist because of these dipole moments. So with this in mind, let's try to answer a few questions to learn more about London dispersion forces and what makes them unique. First of all, what types of atoms or molecules can have London dispersion forces? Well, to think about that, let's think back to the cause of a London dispersion force. What's required is that a molecule has atoms and electrons in it. Any molecule that has atoms and electron cloud will have potentially London dispersion forces because that electron cloud will eventually move to one side or the other. So for answering the question, what types of atoms or molecules can have London dispersion forces? Really, everyone, right? Every atom or molecule has electrons in it, and therefore every atom or molecule can have London dispersion forces. So let's write that down. All atoms and all molecules have London dispersion forces. Now, why are London dispersion forces so weak? Well, we can explain that by realizing that London dispersion forces occur between temporary dipoles. That is to say, the dipoles only exist for a very brief moment in time. And once the dipoles actually change because the electrons are moving around, the force between the two different molecules is lost. So therefore, London dispersion forces only can exist for that brief moment in time while there is that specific dipole. Then once it changes, it's gone. Now, it turns out that some molecules have more London dispersion forces than others. And if you think about it, this makes sense. What causes a London dispersion force? Well, it's the ability of the electron cloud to move from one side to the other. So it would make sense that a molecule with bigger electron cloud or a longer electron cloud would likely have more London dispersion forces. And for this reason, we can say that molecules with a greater molecular weight have greater London dispersion forces, and molecules with a greater surface area, so really long molecules, will also have a greater London dispersion force. Now, why exactly does a higher molecular weight correlate with a greater London dispersion force? Well, it's simply because molecules or atoms with a higher molecular weight have more electrons in them. And more electrons means we can have a greater distortion of that electron cloud, leading to a larger dipole. Okay, so now that we have a basic idea of what a London dispersion force is, let's look at an example where we compare two different molecules that have London dispersion forces, and let's see this effect in terms of their physical properties. We're going to look at molecule carbon dioxide and oxygen, and we're going to see that the boiling points for each of these is based on the greater degree of London dispersion forces that one of them has versus the other. Now, the first thing we want to do is whenever we're looking at molecules where we're comparing the intermolecular forces, let's figure out if the molecules are polar or nonpolar. It turns out that's going to be a major impact on the types of forces that the molecule has. Now, both of these are nonpolar, and the only forces that are present are London dispersion forces. Now, as we learn about more types of intermolecular forces, of course, you'll learn how to predict which molecules have which of those forces. But for now, just take my word for it that these two molecules only have London dispersion forces. Now, what we want to do is predict which one of these, carbon dioxide or oxygen, has more of these London dispersion forces. And what do we base that on? Now, as I said earlier, we want to base the degree or the amount of London dispersion forces mostly on the molecular weight. So if we look at carbon dioxide, we see its molecular weight is 44.01 grams. Now that's greater than the molecular weight for oxygen, which is only 32 grams per mole. So if we want to predict which one has the greater amount of London dispersion forces, of course we would pick carbon dioxide because of its greater molecular weight. So now that we're predicting that carbon dioxide has a greater amount of London dispersion forces than oxygen, is there any way we can predict which one would have a higher boiling point? Well, it turns out there is. Now think about this. Something with a higher boiling point means that it has stronger forces holding it together. How do I know that? Well, think about this. Something with a higher boiling point means that we need to provide it with more energy in order to separate the particles from one another. So if that sample needs more energy to separate the particles from one another, it follows that it must have greater forces holding those particles together. So what can we predict about carbon dioxide versus oxygen? Well, if carbon dioxide has greater forces holding it together, it should have a greater boiling point than oxygen. So let's write our predictions down and then look up the value for the boiling point for each of these. So I predict that the boiling point will be greater for carbon dioxide than it is for oxygen, and when we look this up, it's confirmed. The boiling point for carbon dioxide is negative 78 degrees Celsius, whereas the boiling point for oxygen is negative 183 degrees Celsius. And this is caused by the differences in the London dispersion forces for each of these molecules. All right, so that's an overview of London dispersion forces, our first intermolecular force. Let's go to the next page where we learn about the dipole-dipole force. So we know that intermolecular forces are caused by the existence of dipoles on a molecule or an atom. We just learned about London dispersion forces, which are caused by the existence of temporary dipole moments on molecules. And for that reason, we get very weak forces. Now, if the London dispersion force wasn't based on a temporary dipole moment, but instead was based on a permanent dipole moment, the force would be much stronger. And that's where dipole-dipole interactions come in. A dipole-dipole interaction is a type of intermolecular force that exists between permanent dipole moments. Permanent dipole moments exist on polar molecules. So when you have a polar molecule, you have a molecule where there's more electron density on one side than another, and this is unchanging. This is unchanging because it is based on atomic properties, not on instantaneous effects. Now you have learned how to determine when a molecule is polar or not, right? We look at the Lewis dot structure and we answer certain questions about it. For example, is there a lone pair of electrons on the central atom, or are all of the terminal atoms the same, or are they different? And from this information, we can determine if a molecule is polar or not. And if you find that a molecule is polar, it is guaranteed to have dipole-dipole interactions. Now, what do those dipole-dipole interactions actually look like? Well, that's shown here in this diagram I have below. At first glance, it looks a lot like the diagram we had for London dispersion forces, right? We have the existence of a dipole, and then we have the intermolecular forces between opposite ends of that dipole. So for example, electron poor is attracted to the electron rich side of the dipole, and things line up. Now the difference is that in the London dispersion force, we had a constant changing of this dipole. So we saw an irregular pattern of the dipole arrangement. You can see here in this diagram I have of the dipole-dipole interaction, because we have permanent dipoles, we get a more regular arrangement or a layout of those dipoles. They have an opportunity to align themselves in some kind of a pattern. And because of this repeating pattern and the existence of the permanent dipoles on all of the polar molecules, we get stronger interactions between the molecules in the sample. We get stronger forces between them. So, what types of atoms or molecules can have dipole-dipole forces, and do they also have London dispersion forces? So to answer these questions, let's go back to what causes the dipole-dipole force. What causes the dipole-dipole force is the existence of a permanent dipole on a molecule. This would include all molecules that are inherently polar. So if you determine that a molecule is polar, it will have dipole-dipole interactions. Okay, if a molecule is nonpolar, it will not have dipole-dipole forces. So what about the second question here, which is, do these molecules that have dipole-dipole forces also have London dispersion forces? And the answer to that question is yes. All molecules and atoms have London dispersion forces. So if a molecule is polar, it will have both dipole-dipole forces and London dispersion forces. Now, why are dipole-dipole forces greater in strength than London dispersion forces? Well, they're greater in strength than London dispersion forces because dipole-dipole interactions are permanent. We have a permanent dipole on a molecule. And with a permanent dipole moment on the molecule, that means that the forces between the molecules are not being constantly disrupted by the temporary changing dipole that we see in London dispersion forces. So we can say that dipole-dipole forces are greater in strength than London dispersion forces because they are permanent. They don't change. All right, so now let's talk about hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding is a special type of dipole-dipole interaction that is very strong. It's stronger than both London dispersion forces and dipole-dipole interactions. The cause of hydrogen bonding is when we have a hydrogen atom that is connected or bonded to a very electronegative atom. The atoms that we will look at include fluorine, oxygen, or nitrogen. When hydrogen is bonded to one of these highly electronegative atoms, that hydrogen itself becomes strongly positively polarized. And because we have a polarized bond between that hydrogen and whatever atom it happens to be connected to, we've created a dipole. So to see how hydrogen bonding works in a real example, let's take a look at water. Now I've drawn here two molecules of water. Now in each case, we see that we have a hydrogen atom bonded to a very electronegative oxygen atom. Now because that oxygen is more electronegative than the hydrogen, that means the oxygen will be electron rich, whereas the hydrogen will be electron poor. We can also write this with the delta plus and the delta negative. Now we have these two molecules that exist as dipoles. And as you know, this leads to an attractive intermolecular force between the two dipoles. Now, in the case of hydrogen bonding, it's a specific type of dipole-dipole interaction. It's the attractive force between a delta positive hydrogen and a delta negative atom of some kind. Those atoms can be fluorine, oxygen, or nitrogen. This is called a hydrogen bond. Now, hydrogen bonding is very strong compared to regular dipole-dipole interactions because of the size of the hydrogen atom. Hydrogen is the smallest atom, and it also has the least amount of electrons in its valence shell. So when hydrogen becomes polarized as positive, it becomes very positive, and it's also very small, so it can fit into a lot of spaces. And therefore, molecules that have hydrogen bonding tend to be very closely packed together. So we have a lot of strong interactions going on. Now, when does hydrogen bond actually happen? How can you tell if a molecule has hydrogen bonding? Well, what you look for is a very electronegative atom, like oxygen or nitrogen or fluorine, covalently bonded to a hydrogen. When that exists in a molecule, that molecule will exhibit hydrogen bonding. Now, it turns out that hydrogen bonding is largely responsible for many of the properties that we see with water. And because water is so prevalent in biology and in our environment, it turns out that hydrogen bonding is a very important thing. So for example, hydrogen bonding is the reason why when water freezes, it actually is less dense. And that's because the water actually expands as it freezes because of the presence of hydrogen bonds between the molecules. It's also the reason why snowflakes have the various geometries they have, because of the way they crystallize with hydrogen bonding, creating certain types of patterns. Hydrogen bonding also happens to be responsible for the three-dimensional structure of proteins and DNA, which is actually what I wanted to show you on the next page. So let's go take a look at that. Now, as you probably know, human genetics is largely determined by our DNA sequence. DNA is a molecule that consists of what are called nucleobases. Your genetic code is largely determined by the sequence of these nucleobases within your DNA. Now, in the 1950s, scientists discovered that many of the properties of DNA, including its structure and the way that it is translated into the proteins that exist in your body, are largely governed by the hydrogen bonds that are formed between the different nucleobases which comprise DNA. Let's try to find the hydrogen bonding that exists between two of these base pairs, adenine and thymine. Notice that on adenine, I have an electronegative atom, being nitrogen, that is bonded to a hydrogen atom. That means this nitrogen atom will draw all of the electron density in that bond towards itself, leaving that hydrogen as electron poor, or delta plus. We have the same situation over on thymine, where we have a strongly electronegative nitrogen bonded to a hydrogen. That would leave this hydrogen as delta positive. Also notice that directly across from that hydrogen, in either case, we have another electronegative atom. So directly across from this hydrogen, we have a very electronegative oxygen. If that is delta negative and this is delta positive, we could have a hydrogen bond there. Similarly, if we look at this delta positive hydrogen, we have a delta negative nitrogen over here. We could have a hydrogen bond going across this way as well. So let's go ahead and draw all of this information into this diagram. I have my delta negative oxygen across from my delta positive hydrogen. That forms one hydrogen bond. And then down below, I have the delta positive hydrogen of thymine forming a hydrogen bond to the delta negative nitrogen of adenine. Now, in a previous science course you may have taken, you've probably heard of this base pairing between DNA before, where adenine is paired with thymine and guanine is paired with cytosine. So we get this ATGC base pairing. Now, why is it like that? Why is A always with T and G is always with a C, and we don't see A with C or T with G? Well, that has to do with the structure of these base pairs and the hydrogen bonds that form between them. It turns out that adenine and thymine have complementary structures that allow these two to be associated strongly with one another through a hydrogen bond. And it's because of this hydrogen bond that we get the familiar alpha helix shape for DNA. Now, hydrogen bonding is not exclusive to the nucleobases within DNA. Hydrogen bonding is all over the place. As just one example, I'm showing you here some different types of peptide and protein structures. Now, proteins are the molecules within your body that serve many types of purposes, ranging from structural to chemical. And proteins are made up of peptides, which in turn are made up of something called amino acids. Amino acids are like the building blocks of peptides and proteins. And when you put a bunch of these amino acids together, you end up getting a lot of complex hydrogen bonding. So for example, sometimes the types of amino acids within a peptide or a protein lead to hydrogen bonds that develop an alpha helix like we saw in DNA. This is because of the way the hydrogen bonds are oriented across to the other amino acids. Now, in other cases, we get a different type of protein structure, something called a beta pleated sheet. This has also to do with the types of amino acids that are connected to each other. So hydrogen bonding gives the opportunity for relatively simple molecules to take on very complex and diverse structures, giving rise to the vast diversity of different types of molecules in our body that have very specialized tasks. Everything from breaking down carbohydrates to building structural materials to carrying oxygen on our red blood cells. So, how do we know which molecules have hydrogen bonding and which ones don't? Let's review that. So remember, hydrogen bonding only occurs in molecules that have HF, HN, or HO type bonds. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can determine which of these molecules has hydrogen bonding and which ones don't. Just write yes or no under each molecule and then unpause the video and I'll go through each one. Okay, so the first example here, we have a carbon doubly bonded to an oxygen, and then we have the hydrogens that are directly connected to a carbon. So in this case, we don't have any hydrogen atoms bonded to fluorine, nitrogen, or oxygen. So this first molecule, which is called formaldehyde, does not have hydrogen bonding. So let's go ahead and write no there. Okay, so here in the next example, we see a hydrogen atom bonded directly to an oxygen atom. This means we will have hydrogen bonding in this example. So let's write yes. Now in the next example, we don't have any hydrogen atoms directly connected to any of these electronegative atoms. So this does not have any hydrogen bonding. Now in the last two examples, we have a hydrogen atom directly connected to a nitrogen atom. And in both of those cases, we will see hydrogen bonding. Now, the last type of intermolecular force that we're going to talk about is the strongest of the intermolecular forces. This is called ionic bonding. Ionic bonding results from the attraction between fully charged ions. Fully charged ions form much stronger intermolecular forces because they have a complete charge rather than a partial charge. They're also permanent, so therefore they are very strong. The ionic force is so strong, in fact, that most ionic compounds are solid. However, there are a few known ionic liquids. Compounds with ionic forces going on have properties like very high melting points. So for example, sodium chloride, that's an ionic compound with sodium cations and chloride anions. The ionic forces in sodium chloride are so strong, in fact, that its melting point is 800 degrees Celsius. That's over 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the result of very strong intermolecular forces, the ionic forces that exist between those sodium cations and the chloride anions. Now, as a direct comparison, we can look at sucrose, which is table sugar. Sucrose has a significant amount of hydrogen bonding within the molecule. It also has a greater molecular weight than sodium chloride, so it should also have more London dispersion forces. But it turns out this hydrogen bonding and the higher London dispersion forces are no match for the ionic forces that sodium chloride has. How do we know this? Well, the melting point for sucrose is only 186 degrees Celsius, far below that of sodium chloride. Okay, so let's go to the next page where we can practice this ranking intermolecular forces for different compounds. So I have a table here of different molecules with their Lewis structures, and what I want you to do is pause the video and try to write down for each molecule which forces it would possess. Now remember, you have London dispersion forces, dipole-dipole forces, those are for polar molecules, you have hydrogen bonding, and you have ionic forces. List them out and see if you can rank the molecules with the strongest forces, which would be number 4, to the weakest, which would be number 1. And then when you unpause the video, I'll go through this example. So of course, all of these molecules have London dispersion forces, like all molecules do. So let's write LDF for each of these. Now, that's not to say they all have the same London dispersion forces, but for now, let's just write down LDF for all of them. Now, let's take note of which of these molecules is polar and which is nonpolar. I've written down the polar ones by looking at it and determining if the terminal atoms are the same or if they are different, or if there are lone pairs on the central atom. Polar molecules will have dipole-dipole forces, whereas nonpolar molecules will not. And finally, let's figure out which of these molecules has the capability of forming hydrogen bonds. What we're looking for is a hydrogen atom connected to an oxygen, a nitrogen, or a fluorine. And the only example we see of that here is in this first molecule, where we have hydrogen bonded directly to an oxygen. This is the only molecule that will have hydrogen bonding, so let's write that down. Okay, so now it's time for us to rank these molecules by the various types of forces they have. We're trying to find the one with the strongest forces and the weakest forces first. Now notice that only one of these molecules has hydrogen bonding, And since that's the strongest force, it would make sense that that would be the one with the most intermolecular forces going on. So let's put rank 4 for this first molecule. Now let's see if we can find the molecule with the weakest forces. Now notice the molecule methane, CH4, that I have here, which is nonpolar, only has London dispersion forces. That would make it definitely the weakest. So let's put number 1 for methane. Now we have our last two molecules to deal with. Notice that we have London dispersion forces and dipole-dipole forces for both. So how do we determine which molecule actually has the greater amount of one of those than the other? Well, that's right, we need to look at the molecular weights for each of these. Whichever one has the greater molecular weight would mean that one would have more London dispersion forces. Now, just by looking at the molecular structure, we can see that this molecule, which is called acetone, has a greater molecular weight because of the additional carbon atoms that formaldehyde does not. So we would expect higher London dispersion forces here because of the greater molecular weight. So we'll rank that as 3, and then the bottom one as 2. Now, I also want to show you the boiling points for these. Now, based on this ranking, we would expect the molecule with rank 4 to have the highest boiling point, where the one with rank 1 to have the lowest boiling point, and the other two in the middle. Now, I went and I looked up the actual boiling points for each of these molecules, and I'm going to list these out right on the side of the table here. Now, do these boiling points fit with our prediction about the strongest forces and the weakest forces, and why is that? Well, yes, they do fit. We would expect the molecule with the strongest intermolecular forces to be more tightly bound to itself and therefore have a higher boiling point. And we see that reflected in the boiling point for the first example, which is formic acid, at 100.8 degrees Celsius. The molecule with the lowest boiling point is methane. We see that at minus 161 degrees Celsius. Because there are very few intermolecular forces holding methane together, it boils very easily. We go up from that with the second lowest molecule here, which is called formaldehyde. It boils at only negative 19 degrees Celsius. Okay, if we add some more molecular weight to that, we can get to this molecule, which is called acetone, which has more London dispersion forces and boils at a higher temperature than formaldehyde, at 56 degrees Celsius. So to recap, we've learned about the 4 types of intermolecular forces and the causes of those forces. Now let's keep these forces in mind when we learn in future lessons about the different properties of solids and liquids. With that, I'm going to end the lesson. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you soon.